my definition of spiritual companioning is being with. That's it. I'm not trying to fix you. I'm not trying to get you to a goal. It's not life coaching. It's not therapy. You don't have any problem. You are not a problem that needs to be fixed. You're a person in the world experiencing life in a particular way, your unique way. And I'm with you in that process.
Welcome, everyone, to the Embodied Living Podcast. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Emily Conway. Emily writes a Substack blog called A Thin Space, where she shares poetry and writes lovely personal essays full of sensitive observations about her environment, nature, and her emotions. She writes poetry in a style called Pantu, which we will learn more about later. And what's really interesting is that Emily offers a service called spiritual companioning, which is a type of deep listening that allows her companion to experience being truly and authentically heard and seen. Welcome, Emily. How are you today?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, so let's start with, how did you end up at A Thin Space? Tell us a little bit about the steps along your journey.
Yeah. Well, for spiritual companioning, my spiritual companioning practice is called A Thin Space. And then my Substack newsletter is also called A Thin Space. And the idea of a thin space, I think, is a Celtic idea. Thin spaces are places where the material and the spiritual are very close. And I have always felt like I kind of function at thin space in the world, for good or bad. I felt like I functioned that way. So when I started doing spiritual companioning about 8 years ago now, that felt like a really good name for my practice. And then when I began writing 2 or 3 years ago regularly, I also felt like that was a good name for my newsletter, because I write from personal essays, from the perspective of a thin space, the perspective of being aware and noticing and sensitive to what's going on around me, but also what's going on in me, and how those two things move back and forth, all the kind of flow in and out. So that's kind of how I got to the name Thin Space.
So does thin space means that the barrier between the inside and outside is very fluid? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think I think it can kind of mean what you want it to mean. In Celtic spirituality, there were literally physical spaces in nature that were considered thin, where people would go to kind of experience the spiritual aspect of their lives in a deeper way. But I also think of thin spaces like liminal space, being in between things, moving from one thing to the next. And as humans, we don't love liminal space because we don't love change. But I also think it's a place that we spend a great deal of our lives, because we are always changing and things are always changing around us. Liminal space is like a hallway. I mean, how many times are you in the hallway of your house? You know, a lot more times than you think. But mostly, a lot of your life gets lived in the hallways. But absolutely, I agree. It's also, yes, a thin barrier between what's in you and what's outside of you. I'm sensitive and empathic, and I often find that barrier between what's in and what's out is very, very thin. I spent a lot of years of my life trying to make it thicker without much success. And then I realized, no, this is just who I am. And it kind of accepted that sense of myself. And And once I did that, I was able to be like, okay, now how do I be in the world this way? So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have so many interesting things in what you're saying there. On a logistical level, you're familiar with this Celtic idea of thin spaces.
Yeah.
How did you come to know that? What's your relationship with Celtic ideas?
Not, it's not a very, it's not a very serious relationship. That's what it is. Just
Casual.
I have a Celtic background. I'm a Celt, if you want to go way back, what I am. And I was introduced to Celtic Christianity years ago as I was coming out of much more conservative Christianity. And I don't necessarily identify with Christianity. I always say it kind of, I want to say it's sort of a root in me. It's one of the roots, but it's not something that I necessarily identify with in a theological sense at all anymore. At all. But Celtic Christianity was interesting in the sense that it was much more inclusive and less. Celtic monasteries, for example, had very low walls. So versus Roman monasteries had big walls. It was very clear who was in and who was out. In Celtic spirituality or Christianity, there was a lot more fluidity. So I initially encountered Celtic Christianity and I identified with that. And then kind of in my path, kind of out and open, that was one of the steps on my path, one of the things I passed, But I also know that the idea of thin space goes much further back to older nature-based Celtic spirituality, which I love because I think really right now I'm in a space where I'm really trying to be more present with nature and the earth and asking the earth questions and just being with nature in a new way that I haven't been before. So I might have more to say on all of that in another years. That's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting what you say about the different wall height, right? And then your
Yeah.
comment about trying to build a thicker space within you, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
a very modern thing that we feel like we have to be individuals with an outside border that defines us. And it's not actually the human condition. Right. So it's an artifice. And it's very interesting because that mirrors what you're saying about the walls and the monasteries between an inside and an outside versus a more fluid border.
I love that. I have not thought of that distinction before, and I love it. It makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And it isn't natural to build big structures around ourselves, which is, of course, what we've done.
Yeah.
And we do it to keep ourselves safe. We do it to have a sense of control. But it's a lot of energy spent manufacturing something that doesn't really give us what we want.
Yeah.
And ends up becoming kind of this kind of pseudo, like, cumbersome armor that we have to haul around all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Which sort of leads to the idea of what you're doing with spiritual companioning. So can you describe that a little bit more so that people have a sense of what that is?
Yeah, I can. There are a lot of different definitions of spiritual companioning, or what some people call spiritual direction. I call it companioning because I don't direct anyone. I don't want to direct anyone. I cannot direct myself. So I'm not going to try to do it with anyone else. My definition of spiritual companioning is being with. That's it. And the other definitions that people would give you are something along those lines. but it's being with. I'm not trying to fix you, someone, client. I'm not trying to necessarily get you to a goal. It's not life coaching. It's not therapy. If you don't have any problems, you don't have a problem. You are not a problem that needs to be fixed. You're a person in the world experiencing life in a particular way, your unique way, and I'm with you in that process. So every time I usually meet with people about once a month for an hour. And when I meet with people, I meet them where they are in that moment, what they're working with in that moment, who they are. I help people. I guess if we go anywhere in a spiritual companion, we go in, we're looking at who we are essentially and who that essential person is connected to. How is that person connected to the rest of the world, to the rest of humanity, to the rest of nature? Who are you? How are you experiencing life in the world? But mostly I say it's being with, and it's a conversation. It's a conversation and an opening to whatever comes.
So what I found is that when people think about being with, and this is going to be described as if this is binary, but it's not an either or situation. But sometimes people define that from a kind of personality level, right? There's a level of who they think they are out in the world. And then there's a more general, almost energetic who they are, which it was sort of defies words typically. It defies adjectives. It's not about roles. It's about a kind of fully embodied energy. And so when you're working with people, where are you working in that spectrum?
Everywhere. Yes. We're working all over that spectrum. We're heading toward, I'm always kind of heading people toward that more energetic, non-word, non-notion, the Buddhist idea of notion, the non-notion of you. And I guess when I say essential self, that might be kind of what I mean. It's our essential self, but there's an essential self. There's an essential self thing, down there. And so that's what we're kind of playing with. It's this back and forth that humans beings do, between these two, And one day you might be much more in the non-word, non-notion part of you. And then someday something happens in the world or a circumstance that's very difficult and you find yourself way over here. But ultimately, I'm doing all of that. And every person does that differently. And every person shows up. I've got some people who really want to live over here and that, and some people who are over here and not sure about what's over here. And I think that's one of the things that makes spiritual companioning so wonderful, is that people, my clients, are willing to allow me to be with them on some level as they explore that. Because that takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability. And it takes courage. And so I'm grateful, that I get to be present.
One of the things that you specialize in is working with people that you describe as living in non-traditional roles, which to me is sort of, again, more liminal space, right? In between what's expected and who they are. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. Eventually, after doing spiritual companioning for several years, realized that the kinds of people I was seeing fit a kind of a particular niche, and that niche was people who felt like for some reason their life fell outside of the traditional lines, whatever those words mean for you. And I realized also that was probably because I always felt like my life felt outside. I have always felt like a person who's standing at a window looking in at the world. And I am interested in what's happening in there, but I'm also not sure I really want to go in. And so my experience of life has been that way. And I think then the people who come to see me have, in general, have similar experiences. And I think when I was thinking about that phrase, what does it mean for your life to fall outside? Our culture we've got lots of words for what that means, whether you're neurodivergent or just differently abled or you have gender fluidity but really that phrase is much more important. I'm much more interested in what that phrase means to the client than it does to me. Because for them, it means something deeply personal. And their life can look as normal, whatever normal is, and as from the outside as anybody's. And it doesn't matter. What matters is their interpretation of that and how they find themselves. So, yeah, that's my sort of short take on that.
Yeah, yeah. And so kind of tie that back to spiritual companioning. So how does someone who has this sort of itchy, scratchy feeling like they don't belong, right?
Yeah.
And it manifests sometimes with a life that looks very different than others. And sometimes if you look at them, they're still looking normal, right? They drive a minivan, they're raising kids, whatever it is, right? But inside, there's that feeling of not quite fitting in. So how does spiritual companioning hold that for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, spiritual companioning basically holds space. So as a spiritual companion, what I say in my conversations with people means probably less than anything else in the relationship. What's most important is non-judgmental and compassionate space holding for people. When I first started doing spiritual companioning, I was nervous about saying the wrong things, as you are, doing the wrong thing. Oh, I said that, I shouldn't have said that. And I've realized that no, it really isn't up to me. It's up to me to create the space and to be in it with the person and listen. But that's about it. And that doesn't work for people that itch, which I love. I love it more than anything. Because itches don't often, when you have a mosquito bite, you just itch it all the time, but you're just trying to do a bunch of other things while you're itching the bite, and then you're like, God, that's driving me nuts. And then you ignore it. So they don't get as much attention, maybe, and they get shoved. And sometimes we're ashamed, of those things. So if there is space for people to really say, oh, I have an it. Okay. I have an it. Want to talk about the it? Oh, okay. You talk about the itch a little bit. Yeah. And then begin to see what's there. And I think the itch is just, I think that's just the most wonderful thing, because that's what doesn't feel like the most wonderful thing a lot of time. But that's where the edge is, the thin space is. It's right there. And that's where the good stuff is, the points of growth and capacity, expanding of capacity and that kind of thing. So people can be with that and have space to be with that. I think really important.
It's making me think, sort of circling back to what you mentioned about this Celtic idea of thin space. So in my mind, I have this imaginary space. It's in the woods, in my mind, maybe a little foggy. And you're there and you're sitting on a moss-covered rock and you're there with the trees. And those itchy, scratchy places can just be because you're in this space where it really doesn't matter. You don't have to mask yourself anymore. You don't have to be anything else. You can just sit on the rock.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like what you're doing is creating that space in our real, actual lives. So we don't have to go into the foggy forests of the highlands or lowlands or wherever the fog is, right?
Right. Yeah.
But we can have it carried both inside ourselves and outside in person with you, right?
Yes.
We can have that place where we're sort of
Yes.
metaphorically sitting on the mossy rock
Yes.
and just being. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those spaces are really difficult to find in a world that keeps us very busy and distracted. And so offering people those spaces so that they have a sense of what they feel like. A lot of people don't even know. If you don't experience something, how are you supposed to know? If you don't grow up in a family where that kind of space is even talked about. A lot of us grew up in families where absolutely no space at all. And so offering that space and saying, this is what it feels like, and having someone hold it for you. And then realizing that you can hold that space in yourself, that you can create that for yourself, and that you can become that as a part of who you are and carry it with you all the time, or some of the time, or, an hour every once in a while, through the life that we're living. I think very important and healing, and part of being a whole human.
So let's turn now to the poetry that you've been writing, the pantoum poetry. And it's to me like you're using that as a spiritual practice that accomplishes the same thing of going deeper and deeper into this kind of resting place inside yourself. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I can. A pantoum is just a particular formal kind of poem where the lines repeat in certain ways over and over and over through several stanzas. And I've encountered this form before, but my recent newsletters about the pantoum came as a result of a retreat I took back in February where we did a spiritual practice, where we wrote for 5 minutes on pretty much anything, whatever had come up for us during the retreat. And we just free wrote, didn't stop for 5 minutes. And then we took some time to circle phrases in what we'd written that stood out for us. And we took those phrases and created this formal poem. And I love the idea of this practice because it has a way of sidestepping thought and conscious thought. It has a way of sidestepping that. And when you pull these words out and then mix them up and arrange them in different ways, you begin to see parts of yourself that I think that you don't have access to, really, otherwise. And the particular pantoum that I wrote had to do with a phone booth. And if you're of a certain age, there used to be phone booths everywhere. And we were walking on a trail, and here was this phone booth at the bottom of the trail. And it still had the phone book attached to it. And of course, we picked the phone up, and there was no dial. Everybody also checked to see if there was change in the little holder because you always did that. There wasn't any value. And that really struck me, the phone booth at the end of the trail and the phone with no dial tone. I wrote about the pantoum. I touched on that a little bit, but it was more about community and aspects of relationship that I had found during the retreat. That I recently wrote about it again because the line the phone has no dial tone, I knew it had to do with death, and I didn't want to deal with it the first time I wrote about it. Felt like the whole poem hinged on that. So it's just an example And so in my newsletter, I talked about that, and I began to think about, well, how do I feel about that? So that's the practice there is there's so many rich things that you can come back to over and over in each of those lines around, oh, what's going on for me, here. And that's the itchy spot, right? That we were just talking about,
Yeah. And, it seems like that really, that's sort of epitomizes so much of your newsletter. So often you include a poem.
Yeah.
Often there's some sort of personal essay, some reflective piece, and sometimes ideas for going forward, right? And so it's that same sense of reflection and getting to those deeper places so that you can just be with those itchy spots, be with nature, and be open to what it is in your human life.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. One of the sections or the main section in my newsletter is called Journey. It mostly because I'm a person living, I'm a human living a journey, a life journey. And that's exactly what I do. I notice things in and around me and write about those things and write about being with those things and what happens when I'm with them. I don't want to say, what do I learn? What can I get from it? I don't like those words. I like, again, the idea of being with. What happens if I'm with it? And how does that change me, or what kind of shifts go on in me, or what kind of new noticings do I have about what was already there? And sharing that with people in hopes that there's some connection that people can find in something I say that makes them go, oh yeah, I see that in me, or it's not exactly like that, but it's like this. Like it sparks something in them. Because I write about myself, but I don't really want it to be about me. I really want it to be about the being with and this deep experience of life that's really something that you can't put in words.
So earlier you mentioned how many people don't grow up with a sense of just being able to be with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you could give a few words for young people who may or may not have that support, and if you could help, give them a little word that would help them along this journey, what would it be?
Okay. I love that question because I have 3 teenagers.
So that's the time.
Dear. Oh boy. Yes, I have 19-year-old twin boys and an almost 17-year-old daughter. So we have a lot of that going.
Thick of it. You are in the thick of it.
I really am. But I think what I would say ultimately is to welcome the parts, all of you. Welcome all of you. Be compassionate with yourself and welcome yourself to the best of your ability where you are. Where you are now. And to always just look in before you look out. Look in. Give yourself care. Welcome. Then look. I think that's what.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful.
You're welcome.
So where can people find you if they would like to work with you? Can you give us all of your data?
Right, I have data. Yeah. Well, if you want to read my newsletter, it's econway@substack.com. And the title of the publication is A Thin Space. If you want to work with me in spiritual companioning, and I do that in person, on the phone, or online. Most of my clients are via Zoom because they're in different states. It's a thinsspacedirection.com. And you can contact me through my website. And you can learn more about me there too in companioning.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a really fun conversation. So I appreciate you sharing with us.
I have really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been so fun. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you for joining us today. This has been an Embodied Living podcast. If you'd like to hear more, you can join me at juliarymut.substack.com. That's JuliaRymut.substack.com.